Well, it's 11 o'clock, so we will make a start. We may get some people join us a little bit late. What we tend to find with these sessions is we have quite a few people book on and then obviously receive the recording afterwards. But you're really, really welcome. For those of you that I don't know, my name's Gemma Stacey. I'm Director of the Academy at the Florence Nightingale Foundation. My background is in mental health nursing, and for many, many years I had a joint appointment with Nottingham University and Nottinghamshire Healthcare Trust, where my area of practice and research was all around psychological safety for staff, before psychological safety was really a very well-known term, actually, and obviously before it became commonplace in the language that we hear around responding to the pandemic. So what I'm going to do today is just to share with you some of the literature that's been coming out from internationally in the leadership world around how we can respond to the demands that have been placed upon ourselves and our teams in light of the pandemic, and really think about how we can take care of ourselves moving forward, and sort of challenge some of the language that we hear floating around at the moment as well, about where we might be at as a profession from that perspective. So lots of opportunities for you to comment, ask questions. If you do have anything that you want to say at any point at all, either give me a wave if your camera's on and I'll look out for you, or if you want to use the Zoom wave, I'll also see you there as well. Otherwise, pop your microphone on and just shout, so no problem with that either. I'm going to start off with talking through some of the psychological phases of the COVID-19 response, which has been informed by the British Psychological Society and draws very much on the literature that's come from the military, and in terms of how healthcare professionals and others have responded to events, trauma, crisis that we can relate the COVID-19 pandemic to. I'll follow that up with thinking about the leadership energies as a potential framework to consider this future response to, and help you to think about your own practice, how you lead others within this framework, but also thinking about the organisational culture across health and social care settings. So what I hope you will take away from this webinar is some thoughts around actions and behaviour changes that you might want to implement, either for yourself or for those that you are able to influence, so that we can start to think about the next phase of our response to the pandemic and beyond from that. So as I said before, please do pause, ask me questions, reflect on your thoughts in response. You're very welcome to contribute at any point. So for those of you that perhaps haven't seen this document, what I've done throughout the presentation is to provide links to what I think are really accessible articles. So they're not heavy duty peer review journal articles with great big list of statistics in there. It's all stuff that I think that people like us can pick up and really kind of absorb and take out some key points. So we'll forward the presentation along to you, but this is a document that I would really recommend. So it was published right at the beginning of the pandemic to support organisations to really consider what would be the psychological needs of their staff in the response to the pandemic. And what they described, as I said before, really drawing on the literature from the military, was at the start of the pandemic, we were very much in this preparation phase, and that would be really linked to a sense of anticipatory anxiety. So lots of thoughts about planning for what could happen, people thinking about and imagining themselves in scenarios that were being described in terms of the demands that they would be placed upon. But also needing to mobilise very quickly and not necessarily feeling that they'd had the opportunity to work through the planning processes that they normally would when thinking about such a huge service reconfiguration that was needed. So that was characterised by, for some people, a level of anticipatory anxiety. And what we know about anxiety is, yes, it is a psychological response, but it also initiates physiological reactions within us. So we go very much into that fight or flight mode. We start to think about how our senses are heightened in order to be ready to react to that stimulus. That requires huge amounts of energy, and sometimes, because it's anticipatory, there's no real outlet for that energy. So that's where we can start to be sat with those physiological feelings of adrenaline and hearts beating, those kind of uncomfortable sensations that we feel without really an outlet for it to go into. And that phase was, for some people, very, very challenging. I remember my team at Nottingham, there was a sense that we was kind of waiting for this tsunami to hit. And actually in the first wave, Nottingham wasn't affected into such a degree that other areas were. But the amount of energy that went into this anticipatory phase still left the staff completely exhausted, because they were so worried about the what ifs, what was coming. We then moved into the active phase, and in the early part, you will remember that there was a real sense of camaraderie. It felt like we were all in this together. We were hearing across the media this rhetoric around the heroes of the health service. We were very much solution orientated, and we started to drop down some of the boundaries that perhaps we felt have been quite restrictive in the past. So people were much more flexible about the way that they worked. They really felt like they were part of this kind of greater good. But the impact of that for some people was that they threw everything into that phase, and they really started to lose those natural boundaries between work and home. And lots of people would work additional hours. They weren't able to take leave. And for some individuals, this started to cause tension within their home environments. So families were not necessarily understanding of the pressures that those people were experiencing in the workplace and their need to prioritize work for that period of time. And the active phase is split into two halves. The next sort of phase of this element is around what they've described as disillusionment and exhaustion. And this is basically the fact that we cannot function as human beings in that active phase for a prolonged period of time. The fight or flight mode is there really for us to respond to an immediate stressor, and then we need to find ways to readjust and recalibrate. But we weren't in that mode. It was constant. We were constantly responding to that pressure. And to do that, people just went on autopilot and didn't necessarily really listen to their body or their mind when they were starting to feel those early stages of exhaustion. So sometimes for some individuals, it would just hit them out of the blue. There was also at that phase the start of what you might have heard people term moral distress or moral injury, where people were forced to make decisions or work in circumstances that placed them and their patients in a higher risk than they were comfortable with, and also questioned their ethical code. But they were led to believe that this was the right thing to do to deal with the circumstances at that time. So in order to deal with that dissonance and that tension, people found ways of emotionally connecting from their work or using coping strategies which may be long-term quite unhelpful. So increased alcohol use, for example, diet changing, those types of things we started to see at that stage. Now, this is the bit that I guess I'm wanting us to focus on today, and that's around what the British Psychological Society called the recovery phase. And this is where we start to think about the longer term impact of what we've been through. And at this stage, some really start to have a bit of time to think about some of the challenges they've encountered. Perhaps they've learned things about their own personalities, their own skills, their own attributes they didn't know they had before, and they want to build on that. They see a positive experience as a result of the traumatic experience they've been through. And this is called traumatic growth. So we start to discover things and strengths that we didn't know were there before. For other people, there's a sense of the should have. So there's been quite a few examples of people describing feeling guilty about how they weren't necessarily able to respond to the pandemic in the way that they would have wanted to, maybe because of their own vulnerabilities in terms of their health. Maybe it was because of what the services need from them. And this whole rhetoric around nurses and midwives as the heroes of this response makes it quite difficult for those that are feeling guilty about this to actually own up. So they're holding those kinds of emotions and feelings. Now, some of the literature that's coming out of the countries that are probably around 6 months ahead of us. So this paper, for example, came out from Singapore, was saying that actually this recovery phase is potentially misinformed, because recovery implies that there is now some form of a decrease in clinical demand, which we all know is not the reality. The demand is still there. It's changed slightly, there's no doubt about that, but there are different and competing demands now, whereas before we were focused on the COVID response. Now there are so many other things that need to be remobilized and responded to. So what the author of this paper was talking about was actually it's unhelpful to term this as recovery. And what we need to be thinking more about is our endurance. So how do we accept that within the jobs that we do, there will always be a level of demand placed upon us? How do we accept that that's the case and think about how we can develop the level of endurance we need within ourselves and within our teams to meet this demand without having those longer term negative implications? And what they say is that we need a different kind of leadership. So what we've had previously to deal with the pandemic has been very much along the lines of the command control leadership. There was top-down directives that needed to be implemented, shouldn't be questioned. There wasn't very much space at that time for a shared decision-making approach. What they're saying now is this phase of our response absolutely needs us to revert back to a more authentic leadership approach, where our leaders and ourselves are showing that there are implications to what we've been through, that we need an opportunity to reflect and support each other to process those things, but also being quite realistic with the situation that we're facing. So rather than describing this as a recovery period, which implies that decreased demand, actually saying there are things that COVID has offered us in terms of the way that we do things, the way that we want to improve the way that we work, and we can be optimistic about the future as a result of that, but not denying the significant implications that this has had on individuals and teams. So what this particular author is encouraging us to do is to really focus as leaders on how we can help our teams to manage their energy so that they develop the endurance that they will need, and the service develops the endurance it will need to continue to respond to those demands. So a bit more about this idea of energy. So again, another paper that I think you would find really helpful, published in the Harvard Business Review, talks about what they call the energy project. And Swartz and McCarthy are very much aligned to this idea that if we always respond to being under pressure by working longer hours, we will always have a finite resource. There's only so much of us. There's only so many hours in the day, but our energy levels are a completely different story. And if we accept that every thought we have, every action we take, every feeling we have will influence our energy levels, then we can say, by having a very intentional and self-aware approach to managing our energy, that we can take control of that. And what they propose really is that by focusing in on the different areas that impact on our energy levels, and starting to think about how we can instigate various different behaviours and rituals that energize us and notice the things that deplete our energy, that we can actually expand our capacity. Our energy capacity is expanded, and also we can rejuvenate our energy stores as well. We can't do those things with time. Time is always a finite resource, but there are things we can do to influence our energy. So they suggest there are 4 different energy sources and areas of energy. There is the physical energy, which, you know, no shocks here. This is about our physical health, our well-being, our ability, our body's ability to respond to demands and get things done. We then have the intellectual energy, or the energy of the mind. And this is about our thinking, our reasoning, our curiosity, our analysis, the way that our cognitions respond to various different demands. We also have our emotional energy, which is about connection and relationships, feeling valued, cared for within an organisation and listened to. And then finally, the spiritual, which is probably the one people find most difficult to describe. But the thing that really internally motivates us, the elements around our life, our whole life, that places in a position where we feel content and satisfied, and our well-being is really being attended to. It's very much about our internal values system. And sometimes when you ask people questions about that, you get quite a superficial answer. So to access and understand that spiritual energy source takes quite a lot of self-reflection. So I'm going to ask you guys now to just grab a pen and paper and to draw this diagram out for yourself. And as we go through each of those 4 areas of energy, to start to make some notes about how you think you may change your behaviours. Think about some of those intentional rituals you might want to put into place for yourself, how you can do this for others that you influence, but also how you can start to influence culture within the organisation, so these types of rituals can become reinforced and embedded. So I'll just leave you a moment there to scribble that down so you can make some notes as we go along. And before I just move into that first quarter of this diagram, has anybody got any thoughts or questions on what we've covered so far? Does the literature that I'm sharing with you feel familiar? So if we start off with I think probably the one that feels most obvious, but often the one that we attend to, that drops off, I guess, as soon as we start to feel under pressure. And that's about how we take care of our physical body, our well-being, in terms of things like our exercise, our diet, our routines, all of the things that we perhaps would normally do because we know these things support our well-being. In times of a crisis, just go out of the window. So we start to see people skipping meals, often their breakfast. They perhaps had a good exercise routine previously, it goes out of the window, and sleep patterns start to be really disturbed. And the kinds of things that we would do, perhaps the 10-15 minutes that we would take out in the day just to give ourselves a bit of time away from either the screen or from the kind of the busyness of the working day, those opportunities are diminished. So our physical well-being is impacted as a result of those things. So in that physical domain, the literature, and particularly the Energy Project, really promote this being one of the very first things that we do if we're going to take some intentional action that will potentially impact on our energy, that these are the kinds of things that we can do quickly and get quick wins from them. And they really promote the sense of a routine. So doing the things that enable us to rejuvenate those energy sources, and they are different for all of us, but doing them as a ritual on a routine basis. So even when the pressure is on, that we don't compromise those things, because we know ultimately they will help our energy levels and they'll help our productivity. And things like our sleep patterns are one of the things that they say we should absolutely prioritize. And even if you're not somebody that's a runner, or you don't, the spin classes and things like that, exercise doesn't have to be energetic exercise. They very much say there's something about being out in open spaces. So going out, getting some fresh air, or just an opportunity to really disconnect for even short periods of time from the busyness of the working day. And the other thing that they say, which I think is quite interesting, is that it's not about the length of time, it's about the quality. So even if you can have what they describe as time confetti scattered throughout your day, sort of 5, 10, 15-minute breaks within your day, where you do take yourself away from that busyness of the work. One of the things that I will do is to come away from the screen, make a cup of tea, sit completely in quiet, and just really consciously drink the drink, rather than always drinking just for the thirst and eating for the fuel. It will be about just slowing that process down. And then before you know it, this thing that you've been stuck on, or that email that you've been dreading responding to, or a call that you don't want to make, you work out a way that you can actually address that, so that creative brain arises again. So that's the physical body. And if I could just encourage you now just to make some notes there about how you think individually this is relevant to you, but also how you think this kind of ritual might be encouraged within your own organisation. One of the things we've done at F&F is to start having meetings that start at 5 past and finish at 5 to. So we've always got those 10-minute breaks in between the meetings, and saying, actually that's not a time to check emails, it's a time to do whatever of these things that re-energize you. But if that's going to happen, if it's going to become a ritual, we've all got to do it. As Gina said, we've got to role model it as well. So I'll pause now so you can have a bit of time to think about that one. Okay, I'll move us on to our next leadership energy, which is the emotional. So if I just remind you, this is very much about that connectiveness. It's about relationships where we feel valued, cared for, and listened to. And one of the things that the Energy Project really advocate is raising to our awareness. So being very conscious of the points in the day where our emotions are impacted either positively or negatively, and really starting to understand what triggers those positive and negative emotions. So the times where you feel really, really rejuvenated, maybe it's because of a really stimulating conversation you've had with somebody where you can see you're completely on the same wavelength. One of the things that I really gain a lot of joy from is seeing other people's successes. So often in my team's one-to-ones, it'll be, tell me some of the things that you felt really proud of recently. And that really energizes me to hear about how others feel proud and taking pride in the work that they do. The things that have more of a negative impact will tend to be, for me, the things that cause me to know that I need to act upon them, but I don't necessarily have the time to give them my full attention. So if I know that there's a request that's come in, it needs to be delivered quickly and it doesn't fit into the kind of planned timescales I've got available, I can feel that fight or flight reaction to that, and I know that induces those negative emotions in me. So one of the things that I've really tried to start to do is not to be aware of emails, for example, if I'm preparing to deliver a presentation like today, because I want to be completely present with you guys and really focused on this being my most important focus for this next hour. If I'm aware that there are requests and demands coming in from other angles, I know that won't be possible for me. So that's something that a behaviour change that I've put in place to really notice where those negative emotions are triggered and how I can actively respond to them. They give some more examples about how we can manage those negative emotions when they do arise. So things like mindfulness, the breathing that we can use can actually diffuse a lot of that flight or flight response, that anxiety response that we spoke about before. In the article that I've given you a link to, what they noticed in one of the senior leaders in the organisation they were working with was that this chap would go off and have a cigarette at the points where he was feeling that anxiety. So he'd have 3, 4, 5 cigarettes during the day and not smoke at any other time. And what he was doing by smoking was engaging in that deep abdominal breathing. So by replacing the smoking with a form of mindfulness meditation, he now just doesn't use the cigarettes as his coping strategy. So thinking about ways that we can actively bring down those feelings of anticipatory anxiety is really key. I mentioned before about expressing our appreciation to others, really understanding their motivations, their aspirations. And the evidence says that the effect on us in terms of mitigating negative emotions when we give appreciation is as beneficial as when we receive it. So we should make sure that there's reciprocal opportunity for this within our working days, and we should seek out those opportunities. The other strategy that they describe is about how we positively reframe situations or look at it through a different lens. So some of our negative emotions might be about feeling criticised by someone else. It's maybe that we feel that we failed in a certain situation, maybe that we're not coping with a scenario. And what the Energy Project would encourage us to do would be to think, okay, how might somebody else see this situation? How might somebody who you perceive as perhaps quite bouncy and optimistic and able to flip these things around, how might they see this scenario? The other way to think about it is, okay, the outcome hasn't been what I wanted it to be, but what can I gain from this? What learning can I see that will enable me to grow as a result of this? What has it offered me in terms of developmental feedback? So rather than seeing the outcome as the negative, seeing it as an opportunity for development. So what they're suggesting here really is that by being very conscious of the things that induce those negative emotions, we can be equally intentional about how we manage our response to them, knowing that those negative emotions will deplete our energy levels. So how can we create within our teams a culture which supports this type of a response? And again, just take a moment now to make a few notes of those, perhaps the examples that I shared, those times where, you know, a request comes flying in and you think, how on earth am I going to be able to fit this in? You start to feel the adrenaline pumping, the worry, and you start to become very tunnel vision. That's my example. What might be your examples of those triggers for those negative emotions, and how might we be able to respond to them? Becky, you popped up on camera there. Was there something you wanted to share or comment you wanted to make?
No, I didn't. No, obviously, I don't know what happened to the camera. No, nothing in particular. Lots of reflections on what's been said so far. I think going back to what you said about some people weren't, I was one of those people who was benched as a result of my own health and vulnerabilities. And actually, it was a real struggle for me to think about all of my colleagues working at the front line and me not really being able to do anything. And that was really hard.
Yes, so that feeling of guilt and
definitely.
And a lot of the media representations really reinforcing that if we're not sort of there in full-on PPE, then we're not part of the army that's fighting this.
No, exactly. So it was difficult, and I had to thinking of positively, because that, you know, there was a huge negative emotions attached to that. So reframing the situation, I had to look at it through a different lens and think about, in my quality improvement role, how I might be best placed to support, even if it's from a distance.
Yeah.
So I started getting engaged in wellbeing coffee afternoons and things like that. So I just helped hopefully helped. Well, they said I helped, I don't know, but helped in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. So that point, how can I get a good outcome out of this situation that you find yourself in?
Yeah.
Really brilliant example. Thank you, Becky.
That's all right.
So I'll move us on now to our next quadrant, our third leadership energy. And this is about our thoughts. This is our intellect and our mind, and really about that energy that some of us gather from having opportunity to really reflect, really analyze and consider in depth the work or the various different aspects of our life. So really that energy of thinking, when we're able to invest in that thinking space. Now, one of the things that we notice is that often in the workplace, what is really prioritized and favored is people that seem to be able to multitask. So these people that seem to be able to juggle loads and loads of plates, and they'll be seen as like the real brilliant team players, because you could say, oh, Helen will be able to do it. Oh, well, Helen's got loads on her plate, but actually she'll be able to cope with it because you can just add something on and she'll be fine. And what the literature is saying is that actually the perception of being very good at multitasking and that being a positive is misplaced, and that we shouldn't really request or require people to do that within our teams, because actually by multitasking we're never going to be fully productive, and the time that's taken to undertake any particular task is seen to be increased by 25% if we adopt that kind of an approach. So for example, my board papers are ready for submitting. At the moment, the only time I've got to do it is in between little things, so I'm jumping on and off and on and off it. Actually, if I sat down for probably half a day, I would nail it, but it's going to take me a couple of weeks to get this done because of the way that my diary is at the moment, and also the kids being on school holidays doesn't help either. But that's the kind of thing that that this perception that multitasking is actually a positive attribute, and actually can be quite draining from a leadership energy perspective. The other thing that they talk about is around this idea of switching time. So one of the things that technology is offered us is that accessibility to each other. We're able to contact each other via email, various different messaging services. We've got WhatsApp going on our phones, Twitter has its own messaging, all of these kinds of things. And what can happen is, even when we do give ourselves dedicated time, that we're constantly being interrupted by the various different communication channels. So we again don't focus. And they gave some great examples in that article about how some of the very senior leaders in some big corporations like Ernst & Young, these kinds of things, they would say, actually, I'm not going to be available for these hours in the day. If it's an emergency, you've got my mobile phone number and you can give me a ring. And nobody did. In all of that time, nobody actually rang, because nothing is really an emergency. Similarly, another strategy is about saying, for 45 minutes at 11 o'clock and 45 minutes at 3 o'clock, I will check my emails. But the rest of the time that you don't, you focus on the other elements. And again, the feedback from people that have instigated those kinds of strategies is, in 45 minutes, you clear your inbox. If you're constantly responding, people just respond back to you, and it just keeps on that kind of roller coaster of communication. So these are kind of very practical, again, things that will enable you to protect that thinking space and create those rituals and cultures, again, within your team that promote that type of thing. So we really need to see that this starts from our senior leaders adopting this kind of strategy. This is my biggest weakness, I would say. I think this is the area that I could work on most. I respond in seconds to things, and often that response is not my best response. It's just about ticking it off the to-do list. So really slowing down and giving my attention to the bit of information that's being requested or whatever it is, rather than trying to just get it done so that I can get back onto the things I think are my priority. So again, just make some notes, some thoughts, any reflections if you want to share them on that idea of really investing in the intellectual time, the thinking time. I'll move us on to our final energy source now, our leadership energy, which, as I said at the beginning, is the one that often people find most difficult to describe. So this is our spiritual energy, and for me, this is core, really. It's core to us really acknowledging what it is that internally motivates us. And it's not just about work, it's about all areas of our lives, because sometimes people talk about that work balance, life balance split, but actually we need to acknowledge is, for some of us, our work is energizing. We don't want to assume that our work is the energy depleter and all of the things we do outside of work is what rejuvenates us. That's not the case for everybody. So, and how wonderful is it when you find work that really does invigorate your energy levels. So this is very much about our value system. This is about our purpose, our meaning, our why. I guess, why do we do what we do? And for some people, that answer will be really quite straightforward. For others, it might take a bit more reflection and thoughts. But asking ourselves that question, what do we do best and what do we enjoy best? So what are the things that within our working day really do enable us to feel that we are living our core values? Our values are being put into practice, and we can see the impact of that and the good that it's doing. And when we do that, we can start to think about consciously allocating time to those areas and energy and areas of our lives that will reinvigorate that energy. It has to be individualized. These things are unique to us. The things that float somebody's boat, like I don't know, pulling off those statistics that will enable that person to say this is the difference that this has made, or listening to a patient's story about the impact of a change that's been instigated in your service. Various different things will be the time that we can kind of access what they describe as your sweet spot, and that's at the point where you feel most energized. Now, what we can often find is that for some of us, especially in high pressured situations, that we start to lose sight of this. We lose a bit of a sense of the why. We feel, I guess, more that the organisation sees us as potentially a resource rather than a person. So we have to really invest in understanding that from an internal perspective, and also asking ourselves questions around how the balance of our lives really enable us to live those values. Now, as I said before, this is not something that comes easy to everyone, but possibly because of the work that we're in, we would hope that there is a more sense of a concrete why that drives us. I've done this bit of work around myself recently in some coaching, some executive coaching that I've been having, and I realised that the why was very much about the influence. So the influence that my role within F&F could have on the nursing and midwifery workforce is the why for me. That's so incredibly motivating. And every time I look on Twitter and I see the successes and the celebrations of those that have benefited from F&F, that gives me a sense of real energy, rejuvenation. That's the reason. The other things that perhaps were important in my previous role as a clinical academic around kind of the grant income, the peer review publications, the titles that you achieve as a result of those things, they weren't my why, and therefore they weren't enough to motivate me. So that was a big part of the reason why moving to the charity sector has been such a great move for me. But huge soul searching to get there. So really encourage you to ask yourself maybe the question several times. We do this as that Socratic questioning. So the answer that you would give if somebody asked you the question maybe is quite superficial, but re-asking yourself that question and really getting to the heart of the values that are driving you to do what you do, and then consciously creating opportunity to engage in behaviours that help you either to implement those or to see the benefit of them, is another energy, active energy inducing behaviour change. So there are 4 energy levels, and we're just coming towards the end of our session, but I guess we've picked up on this from some of the reflections we've heard from people today, is that this is about ourselves, absolutely, because it will have individual benefit to us. But also we have to recognise that by doing and engaging these kinds of activities, we are role modelling to others. So where we can say to people that this is what we want them to be doing. So for example, when people are on leave, feeling able to take that leave and completely focus on other areas of their lives. If we're not role modelling that ourselves, what we're doing is undermining those messages. So we can't underestimate the power of role modelling. And also gently, as Gina said, demonstrating to our senior leaders that if they're not role modelling, it will undermine that permission for you and others within your organisation to instigate these things. So we need to see it across every single level of the organisation. There's also opportunity for us to integrate this kind of language into our professional development conversations. So opportunities to positively reframe situations, being able to encourage people to understand their strength and what they have developed and learn as a result of some of the adversity that they've experienced. And also consciously asking people, what are they doing in order to attend to their energy levels? You know, what are the behaviours that they are integrating into their lives that will enable them to endure the challenges that we face ahead? And some of this can then feature into our policies, processes and practices as an organisation. And this has to be based on a belief across the whole organisation that if we invest in personal renewal, we will get better results from our staff and they will be more likely to sustain their performance. And there's huge amounts of evidence to say that this has been the case across all different sectors. Unfortunately, what we hear often from nurses and midwives is that the clinical demand will always take priority over these elements. And we need to start to challenge this and say, we will respond better to that clinical demand if we attend to these areas of ourselves, these 4 areas of our energy levels. So I'm going to stop sharing now. We've got about 10 minutes left just to hear your reflections, any comments, questions from anybody. Had any thoughts about what we've talked about today?
Oh, go on.
Sorry.
Go for it, Leanne.
Yes, I think, Gemma, I think the 4 energies is very crucial. But fundamentally, I really have to say that this recovery phase, you just started off with a very strong message across, which is, I think it's not about recovery from pandemic. I can see that we are not actually at the recovery phase. It is actually an additional burden. In fact, I can see the workloads in the healthcare workforce is actually not double, triple. And there is a sense of drain. It's drained and there's no chance for recovery. I guess it will take us another year to see the progress that nurses, midwife or healthcare worker will really have a sense that, yes, I think I more or less I have recovered or I am recovering. And I am not from mental health background, but I have a lot of mental health colleagues that we have conversations, and the mental health pressure is huge. And as a matron, as a manager, as a nurse leader, I'm now starting to have this conversation one-to-one with the nurses. I think from the emotional and spiritual level, I think these are the 2 key energies I'm focusing at this moment. I think the mind and intellect and the physical, it will come with emotion and physicals being looked after.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a a tweet and an article from Helen Bevan at NHS Horizon that said exactly that, Leanne, that at the moment we are probably prioritising the physical and the intellectual, because we're all thinking about what needs to happen now in order to get our services back up and running and think about the long-term impact of COVID. But actually, if we don't attend to the emotional and the spiritual, we're much more likely to experience longer term reactions, psychological issues and stress, likely to experience attrition from the profession. So it's a real danger zone if we don't give that attention to those energy sources. Thanks, Leanne. That's a great reflection. Thank you. Becky.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on what you said about your why and your purpose. And I think in terms of some of that emotional, spiritual stuff that we talked about, I think maybe some people will have forgotten why they came into nursing in the first place. And I think to be able to give them the space and maybe even facilitate support in a way to get them to get to that point of realization as to why they came in the first place will maybe help them with that endurance, with that resetting, or I guess recovery isn't. I like the word endurance. I think the word endurance is better. Like we talk about resilience, and I'm not entirely sure that I agree with that word. It's more about resourcefulness.
Yeah.
And your own resourcefulness and the resourcefulness as a collective, as a team. And I guess one of the things for me is, whilst I've been working from home a lot, those social networks that I've built, not just on social media, but outside of social media as well, have been hugely important in terms of those relationships. So there is a bit of a new order that's being created in a positive way, I think, as a result of having to find new ways of communicating. And you're never going to beat that face-to-face conversation or that physical touch or whatever, but being able to still have those conversations with people. And the other thing I was reflecting on, I guess, is around one of the things I remember doing on one of the courses I've done previously. It's something about your zone of genius.
Yes.
So it's a chap called Gay Hendricks who wrote a book called The Big Leap, and he talks about your zone of genius and finding it. There's 4 zones he talks about. There's a zone of incompetence, those things you know you're not very good at, but they're part of your role anyway, so you've got to do them. And so in terms of feeling positive about that, you're highly unlikely to. And then there's the zone of competence, so things that you can do, and you're quite efficient at it, but you get no real joy from it. And then it's the zone of excellence, those things that people say, oh, you're really good at that, aren't you? You know, like writing reports, being funny, I don't know. But actually that doesn't bring you joy either. And most people strive to work in that zone, according to Gay. And then it's the zone of genius is the thing where you absolutely derive joy from what you do. In that zone of genius, and it can, you know, it's reminiscent of being a child out on your bike and your mother couldn't call you in for your tea because you were having so much fun, that sort of thing. So that's a tool or a strategy that you could use with teams to try and get them to that point of thinking about purpose and joy in work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I guess that's that sweet spot bit, isn't it?
Yes.
I really like that. I really like that idea, and not accepting that that's not possible. You know, that's the thing, that is achievable, isn't it, in our working worlds. But you're right, Becky. I think re-engaging people with those kinds of conversations right now, because it's probably something that they perhaps feel quite disconnected from at the moment. Yeah. Thanks, Becky. Any other final thoughts from anybody?
Sorry, struggling with the mute. I was just thinking about the role modeling more than anything else. I think I'm very guilty of hypocrisy often in telling my team to switch off after I've just sent them an email, and that there are things that I can do even if I am working late. I can delay the sending of the email. I can send it when I come in the morning. There are tools to affect the time you send out, which I've never really used. And my actions are only encouraging poor behaviours in others. And then when I see my staff burnt out, then I'm contributing to it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. An important reflection of our own practices, isn't it? And how we're perpetuating some of those messages. I did read again in the Harvard Business Review that they did an analysis of the ripple effect of the CEO sending out an email on a Friday at 4 o'clock, for example, and the amount of work that then instigated with people feeling that they needed to respond to that request in that time frame, the stress that was associated with it. So that organization set a rule, whereas after 10 o'clock on a Thursday, the CEO wasn't allowed to email anymore, because they put that as one of their rituals, because they realized that his communication was so influential over the energy levels of the organization, and instigated such a high level of activity and stress that they needed to manage that communication. And I think, obviously, I don't perceive myself as having that kind of impact on people's lives, but there will be an element of that, won't there? When a request comes from you, Anthony, it has a knock-on effect. It has that ripple effect. Really interesting stuff. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Gosh, an hour's not long enough, is it? There we go. Another reflection on the limitations of time. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversations with you all. We have recorded the session. Please do drop Adam an email if you would prefer any of your comments or questions to be edited out of the recording before we pop it onto YouTube and share it with the rest of our wider community. But thank you so much for your engagement. It's been a pleasure. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.